I always believed love could conquer everything. That was before I met him, the man I thought was my soulmate. At first, everything seemed perfect. He had this way of making me feel seen, as if my thoughts, my dreams, and even my fears mattered more than the world itself. His smile could light up the darkest day, and I, foolishly, believed that nothing could ever come between us. I trusted him completely. I loved him without reservations, and in return, I thought he loved me just as fiercely. He knew my heart's every rhythm, every secret. He knew the way I clutched my mother's pendant when I was scared, the tiny silver charm I had inherited after her passing. He even commented once, "Your mother must have been someone remarkable to leave you with something so beautiful." I remember smiling at that, feeling the warmth of his words wrap around me like a soft blanket. I never imagined those words would echo back at me in irony one day. Life with him seemed like a dream. We talked about a future together, about a little apartment filled with sunlight, late-night conversations, and trips abroad. I was naive, blinded by love. I didn't notice the little cracks that began to form, the way he sometimes lingered on his phone with a secretive smile, or the way his eyes darted nervously when I mentioned plans that didn't involve him. I brushed it off as insecurity, as if love alone could explain everything. And then came the opportunity. He told me about a job abroad, a chance to travel and make some money, to see the world while we built our future. My heart swelled with excitement. I trusted him, and I thought this was another step forward for us together. I didn't realize it was the trap I was walking into. The night I left, he held me close, whispering promises I now know were empty. I remember the warmth of his embrace, the way his hand lingered over mine, the soft murmur of, "I'll always take care of you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust him. I closed my eyes, thinking that when I opened them, I would be in his arms again, safe, loved, and cherished. But when I woke up, I wasn't. The first thing I noticed was the strange room around me. The sterile walls, the heavy curtains drawn tight, the unfamiliar sounds of a city I didn't know. Panic surged through me like wildfire. I tried to move, only to feel the cold restraints on my wrists. My heart pounded, my chest tightened, and for the first time, fear replaced love. My mind raced back to him, my boyfriend, my partner, my supposed protector, and the realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. He had betrayed me. He had sold me. Every promise, every whispered word of love, every plan for the future crumbled into nothingness. The man I had trusted most in the world had betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable. Tears blurred my vision as I thought about my mother, about the little silver pendant she had left me, and the life I had dreamed of. How could someone I loved so deeply turn into a stranger capable of such cruelty? I remembered the pendant around my neck. It felt heavier than ever, a tiny weight of comfort amidst the storm of terror. My fingers clutched it instinctively, as if it could anchor me to some part of myself that hadn't been sold, that hadn't been broken. In that moment, I realized I was completely alone, trapped in a foreign land, surrounded by people whose language I didn't understand and whose intentions I couldn't trust. But even in my despair, a spark of anger ignited inside me. How dare he do this? How dare he think he could use me like a pawn in his game? The betrayal cut deeper than any fear, deeper than any loneliness, and as the tears streamed down my face, I felt something else rising alongside them, a quiet, simmering determination. He may have taken my freedom, but he had not yet broken my spirit. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I swore in that moment he would pay for what he had done. And somehow, someway, I would turn this nightmare into my revenge. The room felt colder now, the walls closing in. But for the first time, I felt the pulse of power stirring within me. Betrayal had brought me to my knees, but it had also awakened something I never knew I possessed. I didn't just want to survive, I wanted justice, and my journey had only just begun. The first few days in the foreign country were a blur of fear and confusion. Every sound felt threatening, every glance carried suspicion. The language was alien, the streets unfamiliar, and the faces around me unreadable. I quickly realized that I was invisible here, a possession rather than a person, trapped in a world that didn't care about me. Yet through the terror, I clung to one small thing, the silver pendant that hung around my neck. My mother had given it to me when I was a child, a tiny heirloom etched with intricate symbols that seemed almost magical in their simplicity. "This will always protect you," she had whispered once. At the time, I had smiled at her words, thinking they were sentimental nonsense. But now, in the suffocating shadows of my captivity, the pendant felt like the only piece of home I had left. The buyer, a man of sharp eyes and quiet movements, observed me carefully. He spoke little, but his presence was suffocating, like a predator sizing up its prey. I tried to be invisible to survive quietly, keeping my thoughts hidden behind a mask of fear. But the pendant seemed to have a strange effect on him. The first time he noticed it, he froze mid-step, his hand hovering in the air as if unsure whether to touch it or run. His eyes widened and his lips parted slightly, as though a long, forgotten memory had just resurfaced. Your mother's name?" he asked abruptly, his voice low, trembling with something I couldn't yet understand. I stared at him, bewildered. "What do you mean?" I whispered, clutching the pendant tighter. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted between the pendant and my face, as if trying to reconcile two pieces of a puzzle. For a moment, I thought he might attack me, or worse, but then he simply stared, as if the pendant had cast a spell over him. There was fear in his eyes, yes, but also awe, and something deeper I couldn't quite place. "My mother's name is—" I began cautiously, but the words caught in my throat. How did he know? Why did the pendant have this effect? My curiosity was tinged with fear. He shook his head slightly, as if to clear cobwebs from his memory. "No, I need the full name," he said, more insistently this time. "Not just the first name, the entire name." I hesitated. There was danger in revealing too much, but something in his tone suggested recognition, respect, even reverence. My mind raced back to the stories my mother had told me, stories of a family that once held influence, secrets that had been buried under layers of time, whispers of enemies and allies, of debts owed, and promises made. Could this man be connected to all of that? My mother's name is Elena Vassiliev," I said finally, my voice barely audible. The reaction was immediate. He staggered back as if struck by an invisible force, his hand clutching the edge of the table for support. "Elena Vassiliev," he murmured, almost in disbelief. She is gone, I thought." His voice faltered. "I thought no one would carry her legacy forward." I stared at him, a mix of fear and fascination flooding through me. The pendant, the heirloom my mother had left me, wasn't just a keepsake. It was a key, perhaps to understanding my past, to unraveling secrets I had never known, and maybe, just maybe, to my escape. For the first time since being sold, I felt a flicker of hope. This man, my captor, suddenly seemed less invincible, less untouchable. There was a crack in the wall of fear that had surrounded me, and through it, I glimpsed the possibility of turning the tables. But I couldn't let him know that. I had to appear weak, vulnerable, terrified, yet every glance at the pendant reminded me of something else: strength, heritage, and the untapped power my family once held. I realized then that survival wasn't enough. If I was going to escape this nightmare, and if I was going to face the betrayal of the man who had sold me, I needed to understand the history of the pendant, the legacy of my mother, and the mysterious power it seemed to hold over this buyer, As I held it tightly in my hand, the weight of it felt different. It wasn't just silver and engravings. It was my lifeline, my secret weapon, and perhaps the first step toward justice. The first step toward revenge. And as the buyer stared at me, wide-eyed and unsettled, I felt the faint stirrings of something powerful. The realization that this nightmare could become the stage for my reckoning, and that the man who betrayed me might one day wish he had never underestimated the girl he thought he could control. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever imagined. The buyer's behavior had changed since the moment he noticed my pendant. He no longer treated me like mere property. Instead, he watched me carefully, as if weighing every word, every gesture. There was caution in his movements, an unspoken respect, and sometimes fear. I didn't yet understand why, but instinct told me this was no ordinary man, and my pendant was the reason. One evening, while he was distracted with documents in his office, I dared to ask the question that had been burning in my mind since he first froze at the sight of the pendant. "Why does my mother's name matter to you?" My voice was quiet, almost timid, but it carried a thread of curiosity I could no longer suppress. He paused, then turned slowly, his dark eyes flicking toward the pendant that rested against my chest. "Your mother, Elena Vassiliev, she was not just anyone," he said carefully. She was powerful, dangerous, respected in ways most could never imagine. His voice trembled slightly, betraying a mixture of reverence and fear. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean, dangerous, powerful? She was my mother, not..." My words faltered. I realized I didn't know the full truth. My mother had always been kind, loving, quiet in her strength. The stories she told me as a child were always tales of courage and justice, of helping the powerless, of standing up to those who sought to harm others, but I had never known she had enemies, or influence beyond the home. The buyer nodded slowly. She had enemies, people who underestimated her, people who thought they could control her. Your family, your mother, you carry a name that commands loyalty and fear alike. He paused, his gaze sharp. "And this pendant, it proves your lineage. It is more than jewelry. It is a symbol of her legacy, a key to alliances and warnings long forgotten." I clutched the pendant, a cold shiver running down my spine. I had always thought of it as a memory of my mother, something sentimental and protective. But now I realized it was a weapon, a declaration of identity that even the world I had been thrust into recognized and feared. "You mean my mother's enemies might still be out there?" I asked cautiously. He shook his head. "Some are gone, some are waiting, but you, carrying her pendant, you are no longer just a child in her shadow. You are the inheritor of her power, and they would not dare cross you, at least, not if they know who you are." The weight of his words settled over me like a storm. I had been sold, betrayed, stripped of freedom. But suddenly, the chains felt less permanent. I wasn't powerless. My mother's legacy was alive in me, and the very object I had clung to for comfort could now become my tool. That night, I lay in the small, cold room that had become my prison and thought for the first time in days not of fear, but of strategy. If this man feared my pendant, if he recognized my lineage, then perhaps I could turn this captivity into my advantage. Perhaps I could gather information, learn the dynamics of this world, and find a way to make the man who betrayed me, my boyfriend, pay. I realized my anger, my heartbreak, and my betrayal were now weapons, sharpened by the knowledge of my family's history. Every insult, every deceit, every lie he had spun now fueled me, the fire that had simmered quietly in my chest since my capture began to roar, demanding action, demanding justice. The buyer watched me more closely after that, sometimes speaking in hushed tones about business, about power, about the complicated networks that my mother had once navigated with ease. I listened, learning silently, letting him underestimate me. Every story, every detail, Every pause he allowed me to witness became a thread I could later weave into a plan. I no longer felt like a victim, I felt like a force waiting to awaken. My mother's strength coursed through me in every heartbeat. The pendant glimmered faintly under the light, a reminder that I was not alone, that my family's legacy had not been extinguished. And in that realization, I discovered something far more dangerous than any captivity: hope tempered by vengeance. I knew the day would come when I would confront my betrayer, when I would reclaim my dignity, and when I would ensure that the man who had sold me would pay in full for every tear, every moment of fear, every second of helplessness he had caused. I was no longer the girl who had been tricked and sold. I was becoming a woman forged in betrayal, sharpened by secrets, and guided by the legacy of her mother. And soon, very soon, the world would see just how unstoppable that combination could be. The air in the foreign mansion felt different now, charged with tension that I had learned to read like a map. Every glance, every movement of the people around me spoke volumes. The buyer no longer saw me as a helpless girl. He regarded me cautiously with respect, and I suspected a bit of fear. The pendant glimmered against my chest, a quiet but undeniable signal. I was no longer someone to be overlooked. I had a plan, and every detail I had observed, every whisper I had overheard, would play a part. My thoughts kept returning to him, my boyfriend, the man who had sold me like a commodity, whose betrayal had shattered my world. I could almost feel the bile rising in my throat as I remembered his charming smile, the warmth in his voice, and how easily he had betrayed me for greed. He had underestimated me. He had thought that fear would keep me silent. He had thought that love, or at least my trust, was enough to bind me. He was wrong. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. My boyfriend, unaware of the storm I had been quietly preparing, visited the buyer to discuss unfinished business from the previous deal. He swaggered into the room with his usual arrogance, not noticing my presence at first. The moment his eyes fell on the pendant around my neck, a flicker of recognition passed over his face. But it was too late. The tables had already turned. I stepped forward, holding my head high, letting the pendant catch the light as if it were a crown. "You sold me," I said calmly, my voice steady but filled with venom. "You thought you could get rid of me and face no consequences. Did you really believe I would remain powerless forever?" He laughed nervously, trying to mask the panic creeping into his eyes. "It's not what you think," he stammered. I ignored him, turning my gaze to the buyer. "Do you recognize this pendant?" I asked softly. His eyes widened just as they had when he first saw it. I saw a flash of understanding pass between us. It was all I needed, you see. I said, my voice growing firmer. My mother was Elena Vasiliev. She commanded respect, loyalty, and fear. Those who betrayed her or crossed her, they didn't last, and I carry her legacy now. The buyer nodded, subtly signaling to his men. My boyfriend's confident posture faltered, and for the first time, I saw fear etched across his face. His lies, his charm, his bravado, all crumbled in a moment. I don't understand," he whispered, voice trembling. "You will," I said, my eyes boring into his. "You see, the world I was brought into, the one you tried to trap me in, doesn't forgive treachery lightly, and I am not the helpless girl you thought I was." The buyer stood, imposing and silent. He motioned for my boyfriend to come closer. "He is yours to deal with," I said, my lips curling into a faint, satisfied smile. "Make him see what betrayal costs." What followed was swift. My boyfriend, once so arrogant and untouchable, was exposed for the fraud he was. The buyer confronted him with evidence of his schemes, his lies, and his illegal dealings. Every connection he had relied on crumbled as alliances shifted against him. And through it all, I watched, a quiet witness to the justice that was finally unfolding. When it was over, he was left stripped of dignity, powerless, and humiliated, unable to meet my gaze. I felt no joy in seeing him broken, only a calm satisfaction. Justice had been served. I had survived betrayal, captivity, and fear, and emerged stronger than ever. The pendant glimmered against my chest as I turned away from him. It was more than a symbol now. It was proof that I had reclaimed my life, my freedom, and my identity. I was no longer the girl who had been sold. I was the woman my mother had prepared me to be: resilient, cunning, and unbreakable. As I stepped into the sunlight outside the mansion, the air felt like liberation. Every breath was mine again. I knew the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in months, I felt in control. I had learned that betrayal could be transformed into power, that pain could become strategy, and that even the deepest heartbreak could forge a weapon sharper than any blade. And as I walked away, the pendant resting against my heart, I made a silent promise: no one would ever underestimate me again. I had been betrayed, but I had turned that betrayal into triumph. I was free, I was powerful, and I was finally, irrevocably unstoppable.